So I am a historian, a professional historian. I work in a university. I have a fancy history degree. And when I go to like parties or social events and people ask me what I do, I usually say, yeah, I'm a professor of history. And that always kind of receives weird responses, right? People sometimes say, oh, I hated history in school, right? But other times people say, oh, I love history. Inevitably, those conversations tend to lead to the person saying one phrase that has become a kind of pet peeve of mine. They'll use the phrase, history teaches us. And I don't like this phrase for a few reasons. The first is that it treats history as if it's one kind of solid, static narrative, right? History is this sort of thing that you can hold in your hand and it doesn't change and it's always the same thing, right? History is this kind of oracle that just speaks to us from beyond the grave, right? And always says the same thing. The second thing that I don't like about history teaches us is that it totally divorces the idea of history from the historians that write it. You see, history is just the writing of people, of historians like me and like lots of other people. They're the ones that tell the narrative of the past. And so saying history teaches us sort of makes it abstract, like it's this, kind of ghost of Christmas past that gets to sort of just show up and get, reveal the truth, without actually understanding that history is just the product of historians. Okay, these are all kind of nitpicky things. I don't actually say this to people at cocktail parties or, at social events. But they do illustrate something that I think is important for this video, that history is much more complicated than the way that people usually treat it. In this video, we're going to try to answer the question, what is history? We're going to look a little bit at defining the term history. Then we're going to explore sort of history and complexity and why history is complicated. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the forms of history, some of the ways that history sort of shows up in the world. All right, let's start by defining history. I think maybe the easier way to approach this is not to talk first about what history is, but to talk about what history is not. So let's think about some things that history is not. First and foremost, history is not the past. The past and history are different things. History is the study of the past. It is writing about the past, but the past and history are not equal, right? There are an infinite amount of things that have happened in the past that historians have not written about. So history is the thing that historians write about when they're talking about the past, but it does not include everything that has happened in the past, like before this time. Second, history isn't just facts. I think a lot of times people want to turn history into sort of a this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, right? A narrative just of details, of things that existed in the past. But actually history is much bigger than that, and history is much more about answering questions about the past and providing interpretations about the past than it is just a sort of gathering of facts about the past. Third, history isn't just made up stories. What I mean here is that history is a particular type of writing that is, what we might call nonfiction writing, or writing that sort of assumes that it's about the truth, or it's about reality at least from reality from a certain perspective. So when people write histories, they aren't able to just make up the stories that they want to tell. They have to base those stories in some sense of reality, some sense of truth, some sense of this actually happened. And that brings us to what history is. So if you can flip the other side of the coin, what are some things we can say about history to kind of identify it in a positive sense? First, history is argument and interpretation. So like I said before, history is not just facts. What that means is that when you read history, history is not just a kind of narrative of absolute truths, right, that have been sort of dug up from the ground and revealed in some sort of pristine way. In fact, what historians do is they write interpretations about what they think about the past, why they think things happened, how they think things happened, and they form that into arguments. Arguments here not meaning, mano a mano sort of fist fights or anything like that, but instead arguments here meaning reasoned cases about why they think what they think about the past is true. Second, History is an empirical discipline. Empirical here is the key word. Empirical means evidence-based. And why this is important is sort of think of the point that I made before about how history isn't just made up stories, right? All histories have to be based on evidence, based on data, based on something that we can sort of rely on to show that the stories about the past that we're telling are not just made up stories, but stories that have some element of reality to them. And that requires evidence. Third, history is complex and continuous. What we mean here is that it takes lots of different forms and is never finished. We have never figured out, and we will never figure out, the full, complete history of, well, anything really. The Roman Empire or ancient Babylon or whatever, right? There is no such thing as the one complete authoritative history of anything in the past. That's because the past is infinitely complex. So the work of the historian is continuous. It goes on and on and on. People have been writing histories about Rome for thousands of years, and they will continue to do so for many, many more. Finally, history is the study of the particular. This is probably the hardest to kind of grasp. And it's particularly hard for those of you who are coming in from maybe different disciplines like, say, sociology or psychology or other disciplines like that. Because this is one of the things that makes history as a discipline somewhat unique. You see, most academic disciplines are searching for reality. They're searching for truth in some sort of universal way. Sociologists, for example, are trying to study how human communities come together and behave. Psychologists are trying to figure out the human mind. Political scientists, for example, are trying to understand how political societies exist and change. And all of these studies are, first of all, fantastic studies and important things to study, but they're essentially studies about kind of universals, about how things behave in an abstract kind of universal sense. Something that makes history, particularly history in the kind of modern period, unique is that history tends to be a discipline that focuses on the particularity of certain places and times. In other words, historians focus in on certain people in a certain place, in a certain moment in time, and don't assume that those people are exactly the same as people in other places, in other moments of time. In fact, time is the most important variable for the historian. This is a great quote by a friend of mine at Michigan State University, Rona Steinberg, who said this once at a conference, and I thought this is a really good way of thinking of history. Even though history is a study of the particular, it has to make sense to people in a current moment as well, and it has to matter for people in the current moment. So this is what Rona Steinberg said about this kind of phenomenon, right? He said the practice of history is a constant movement back and forth between empathy and alienation. What he means here is that while history is focused on the particular, on finding out how and why something happened in a particular time and place in the past, it has to be a story that then connects to readers in the present. Okay, we know a little bit about what history is not, but now I think it's important to kind of dig in a little deeper and look at how history can be complicated, how and why history is so complicated. Okay, earlier I said that history is complex. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, history is about people. And people, if you haven't noticed, can be really, really different, right? There are old people, there are young people. People can be different based on lots of different types of identities, gendered identities, ethnic identities, all sorts of things, right? They can speak different languages. They can live in different places. They can have infinitely different experiences in their lives. People are infinitely complex. And what that means is that if history is about people, then histories too have to be complex. Ultimately, what that leads us to is an understanding that complexity in history is in fact a good thing. Whereas, say, in the sciences, people want to, or academics want to try to understand something and simplify something, right, and get to a sort of single answer on a particular question. Historians tend to go the other way. Historians tend to think that when the answers get more and more complex, we are understanding a problem better. Complexity in history is good. This is why I really like a quote from Anthony Brundage, and this is in the book that you'll be reading for this class, so spoiler alert. But Brundage kind of defines history in a really important way in this quote. Here's what he says. He says, "It's also possible, indeed critically important, to offer at least a glimpse of a very different concept." And here he's kind of comparing previous understandings of history as being sort of simple, right? And he says, the concept is history as a dynamic process. By this, I mean a rich, varied, evolving intellectual system that allows us to achieve a deeper and better understanding of our world, indeed of ourselves. History as a dynamic process. What does that mean? Well, it means that history is an ongoing, ever-changing effort to understand the world around us and the past. So what this means essentially is that history is never done. It's never finished. It's never a complete process. It is always ongoing, dynamic, constantly being written and rewritten and revised and added to. And now I want to finish this video by looking a little bit at what history is like now. For this first module, what we're really going to do is trace kind of the development of history over time. But I want to start actually in the present moment and ask ourselves, what does history look like right now? What are the types of history that are out there right now? And how are they different? So I haven't given you a really simple answer to the original question, what is history? I'm sorry about that. It's complicated. I think you've come to find that out now. But if we're looking for some sort of simple bullet points, I think this one might be fairly good. This comes from the Stanford History Education Group, and it's a short bullet point list, and it doesn't sort of cover everything, but it's a nice way to think of some things, or some ways to identify history. Right? Here's what the Stanford History Education Group sort of focuses on. First, they say, of course, history is an account of the past. That makes sense. But then they follow that by saying accounts differ depending on one's perspective. That's a way of saying history is written by historians, and historians come at the past in lots of different perspectives in lots of different ways. Third, they say we rely on evidence to construct accounts of the past. So the Stanford History Education Group acknowledges that history is a discipline that is empirical, right? That it's based on evidence. Fourth, we must question the reliability of each piece of evidence. Now, this is something we're going to tackle in Module 2 of this class, but one of the most important things that historians do is they not only find evidence, but they also read that evidence critically. That is integral to the process of being a historian and writing history. And then finally, the Stanford History Education Group says within history, right, any single piece of evidence is insufficient to build a plausible account. This is another way of essentially saying that empirically, we have to build our interpretations of the past on lots of evidence, on as much evidence as possible. So this is a nice kind of account of what history is. But I want to give you one more graphic, or I want to show you one more graphic to think a little bit more about the forms that history takes. If this is kind of the central idea of what history is, then how does it show up in our world? Well, this is a really good infographic, and I think it tells us a good narrative about what history is and how it shows up. First thing that I like about this is that this graphic identifies the fact that history and the past are not the same thing, right? The past is an infinite collection of events and people and things that have happened before right now. So the past is its own thing. And historians are sort of, they only get the past by way of things, by way of evidence, by way of documents and artifacts and stories and whatever else exists to kind of crystallize the past into something that transcends time. But then different types of historians take this evidence and do different things with it. And here I want to highlight three of the kind of main forms of history that exist today. The first is academic history. This is history done in institutions like universities and colleges and historical societies and places like that. And oftentimes academic historians have their own sort of rules for how they go about what they do, and they tend to produce very particular types of things like books and journal articles and stuff like that. Academic history is the thing that we're really going to focus on mostly in this class because what I'm trying to teach you to sort of do, what I'm trying to instill in you is the kind of rules and regulations and procedures and policies and all the kind of trimmings of what it means to do academic history. But it's not the only type of history. There is public history. And we'll talk a little bit in the final module of our class about what it means to do public history and how you might go about a career in public history. Public history is essentially history, but specifically geared towards impacting a large public. This happens through everything from museums to reenactments to all sorts of things. And then finally, there's popular history. Popular history is history just for sort of popular consumption for entertainment in a lot of ways. Who among us doesn't love a good historical video game or a great movie about the past? This is what popular history tends to sort of take the form of. So it's important to kind of understand that history shows up in lots of different ways. And while all of these ways are good, they tend to have different ways of going about telling the story of the past and constructing their stories of the past. Okay, so as we can see, history is a pretty complicated thing. We're going to spend the whole rest of this module talking about kind of how we got to where we are now, right? Where does history come from as a discipline, and how does it develop over time? That will be the purpose of Module 1. But with the next video, what I want to do is to kind of dig deeper into what history is now in an academic sense. That will be the kind of building block or the foundation that we'll use to look back on the history of history for the next few weeks. Okay, that's it for now. See you in the next one.